I'm thrilled to kick off what I'm sure will be a fantastic few days of networking and learning. I love the Midwest show. Intersolar and Energy Storage, North America Midwest, has perennially been one of those shows that really feels like a homecoming, but also the Midwest really feels like a proving ground, never more than now. And all of you are participating in proving what the grid of the future will look like. Today we're going to talk with some folks that have a very insider perspective on how that grid is being developed. You see, for much of the last decade, the conversation for most of us have been about deploying as many renewables as possible. And the grid is becoming more complex as a result. Utilities are navigating changing demand patterns, evolving customer expectations, affordability pressures, increasing levels of distributed energy resources, thanks to all of you, and growing expectations around reliability and resilience. We're fortunate this morning to have leaders representing 3 different utility perspectives across the Midwest, and I'm excited, as you all are, to learn from each of them. So rather than reading through lengthy biographies, which if you've downloaded the app is all right there for you, download the conference app, I'm going to let each of them briefly introduce themselves as we get started. To kick us off, I'd love for each of you to briefly tell us who you are and your role, who you serve, and then answer this question. From your perspective, what has changed most dramatically in utility planning and operations over the last 3 to 5 years? Let's start with you, Bria.
Sure. Thanks, Nico. Morning, everybody. I'm Bria Shea. I'm the president of Xcel Energy for North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota. I'm headquartered in Minneapolis, so not too far away. Glad to join you all this morning. Xcel serves 8 states, so along with the upper Midwest, we also serve Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas. And as you think about kind of the geographic layout of that, we are blessed from a renewable perspective that we have rich solar and wind or both in every one of those states. So really well positioned. We are early adopters of wind and now increasingly improving our solar position as well. So I think from a renewable perspective, we have a great starting place to kind of get into this energy transition. And so, Nico, to your question about what I think is the biggest change that we're seeing right now is first, it's the size and scale of the load growth, right? We used to have slow to no to fairly easily predictable load growth, and now we're not sure when it's coming, where it's going, and what the size of it is. So certainly that is influencing as we think about the future. And we're not just adding new load growth, we are also in the middle of retiring our coal and moving away from some of that centralized generation that we've previously relied on. And so taken together, those 2 things are really changing, I think, the way that we are thinking about all of this. And so when Xcel is thinking about these technology companies in particular, if I'm thinking about hyperscalers or even, manufacturers and some of those significant sources of load growth, they are moving at the pace of technology. We cannot be moving at the pace of infrastructure, which is what we've historically done, right? So thinking about how you tackle this, Xcel's thinking about that in 3 ways. And that's first, we're thinking about speed. We've really changed how we plan. We're not just doing generation and then transmission and then distribution, right? We're doing all 3 all at once. And reliability used to be, do you have enough generation to serve your customers? Now it is, do you have the right generation in the right place at the right time? So it's that deliverability factor that is really, I think, the crunch point. So certainly we're thinking about speed, planning all of those things in tandem so that we can move as fast as possible. Next is simplicity. Really getting the rules right. So as we're thinking about permitting reform or making sure that Xcel understands how we can move forward so that we can set that same expectation with our customers and regulators. And one example of this, for instance, is we've filed large load tariffs in almost all of our jurisdictions, which basically are just setting the parameters for how we intend to add those large customers like a hyperscaler. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, here later. But really, it's just to, if you want to do business with us, this is what it looks like. And so I think you get a significant gain gain in simplicity that way. And then last is just scale. We're thinking about how are you leveraging all of the tools, the people, the programs, the technology, to make sure that we can meet this, opportunity of a lifetime. It's not just one program. It is the entire one project. It is the entire system, right? And so I think I'll end it there now. Yeah.
Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, thanks, Nico, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting me here. I am Andy Plenge. I'm our Vice President of Strategy and Energy Policy at Commonwealth Edison, ComEd, as it's known here. We serve Northern Illinois, which is predominantly, from a population perspective, the city of Chicago. So we serve 70% of the total residents of Illinois by virtue of that, but a kind of smaller portion of the Illinois geographical territory. We are solely electric, and we are T&D only, so the wires, and our generation is procured from the PJM marketplace, which I'm sure we'll spend some time talking about today. And then, my role within the company is I oversee our energy procurement function, so interfacing directly with the Illinois Power Agency. I also have our Clean Energy Solutions business, which oversees our energy efficiency and demand response programs. We think our energy efficiency program is probably the largest utility run one in the U.S. So it's we spend about $450 million a year, which is been a huge benefit for our customers. And then lastly, I have our strategy team, which kind of thinks about how to navigate the increasingly complex world, which gets me to the question at hand. I think you will, unfortunately, Bria hit a lot of the points I would make. Load growth and distributed resources for us are absolutely kind of some of the biggest ones. So a couple like nuances to that, and then one additional point I would make. One, Illinois, Chicago in particular has been, I think we put up our first, or hosted or connected our first data center in 1999. So Chicago is sort of one of the top 3 to 5 data center markets in the U.S. So we are kind of in some ways ground zero. And the scale of what we're seeing and have been seeing over really the last couple of years, you don't even have to go back 5 years, which is incredible to start to think about how much the world has changed. We've got about a peak load, which we hit in 2011, which is still the encouraging data point. We aren't even where we were back before energy efficiency really ramped up, was 24 gigawatts, and we have at least that, if not more, in kind of some various stage of inquiry from our customers. So we've got a lot happening there on the load growth front. I'll kind of reiterate something that Bria mentioned in the way we've thought about it is, to kind of build a data center, get that online, you can kind of do that in like a 24-month timeline, just in terms of building the shell, getting the chips, all of that. When people talk about what it takes to get a gas plant online, as an example, that's 5 to 7 years. And I think we have really taken for granted that, you would sort of see the load growth, the PJM market would sort of run the auction, and it would all kind of work in sync. And that's just really not happening anymore. Jealous of, Brice and I were talking about, jealous of Bria's ability to sort of plan that all together. We are working through that here amongst all the stakeholders in the PJM marketplace, but that's going to be something to navigate. Distributed resources, I imagine we'll touch a little bit more on, but the last one I'd mention is what's really changed is Illinois has made a big shift towards kind of a multi-year planning framework that was brought in as a result of CEJA. And so one thing we've done and been able to do is from a planning perspective, start to think about what's our next sort of 4 years of investment look like, and lay that out and get alignment with our stakeholders and ultimately the commission to invest. And so operating under that framework, understanding how to explain why things don't play out exactly as you expected 4 years out ahead of time, and we're in our first cycle of that multi-year planning framework, has been a learning opportunity for us, and it's really forced us to start to kind of plan multiple years ahead of time in order to make sure that we're marching along the path that our regulators agree is appropriate. So I'll end it there.
Thanks, Andy. Brice?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Brice Sheriff. I'm Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs and Energy Supply for Ameren Illinois. So in that role, obviously all the regulatory matters, I'm kind of the liaison between the ICC as well as staff, working through a lot of stakeholder processes, which I'll touch on here a little more later. And then the energy supply, we have both gas and electric in Ameren, Illinois. So about 1.2 million electric customers, 800,000 gas customers. My office, we're a T&D, as Andy mentioned as well. We purchase all the electricity, all the gas, work with the hedging strategies around that. In Illinois, a little different. We work with the IPA on hedging for our capacity, and then in the end of the day, we're buying that through the MISO capacity auction. As it relates to planning and how that changed, Andy touched on it a little bit, right? The CEJA, it wouldn't be in Illinois if I didn't bring up CEJA, right? The CEJA legislation that was passed really set forth a planning mechanism for your planning cycle that really sets the stage for what utilities are going to look like as we plan these things out over the future. I was reflecting on just the amount of time and energy that goes into these stakeholder meetings, and I'm sure there's several of you in the audience that have been part of those discussions, right? It's a little bit exhausting sometimes. I look back in 2023 and we held roughly 20 meetings prior to the filing of the grid plan. This last grid plan in 2026, we hosted 105 meetings. That's not hours, that's meetings. We had 52 topic-specific multi-year integrated grid plan discussions. So, the planning from when I started with the company, Bria and I were talking earlier, I've been with the company about 12 years now. It's like night and day to what the way it used to be, the way utilities did their planning. And that was a policy set forth by the governor of the state and the General Assembly with CEJA that we're going to make this a very robust, stakeholder-driven process. We look at this as a partnership with all of you, with the renewable community, all the stakeholders out there, right? We encourage people. Many of you are in those meetings. There's a lot of folks that have a lot of different opinions. It's challenging sometimes, and it can be frustrating for everyone. But at the end of the day, I think we need these partnerships, right? We need to get on the same page of how we're going to continue to progress and move into the future. The last thing that I'll mention that we're kind of getting into on the planning process is obviously the integrated resource plan. This was set forth in the SERJA legislation, which just went into effect June 1st. But we have been engaged with the commission. I know ComEd as well. Having these discussions, thinking about this. This is kind of a foreign thing for us, right? We haven't done planning to this extent in a long time since deregulation in the state of Illinois. I think that the planning aspect of it is, and particularly the integrated resource planning of it, is going to be critical to make sure we have reliable energy, number one, and make sure that it's cost effective for customers. We hear a lot of things today out there around customer affordability and impacts of it. And really, I think it's a tool that we can use, as we continue to move towards new legislation, new ideas that we can point to General Assembly members. We all know these topics are complicated, right? It takes years to fully digest them, and then we're asking General Assembly and policymakers to make decisions with somewhat limited understanding of what the situation is. So having an IRP, a document that they can kind of, I'm an old sports guy, so the X's and O's, like look at what we need to get to the place we want to be in the future. I think that's going to be key.
For those of you who are just joining us, welcome. This is the morning keynote for Intersolar Energy Storage North America Midwest. It's great to see you all here. We have an esteemed panel of executives from Ameren, ComEd, and Xcel sharing their perspectives on how the grid planning, operating is changing and in many ways shifting under our feet in terms of how we build the grid of the future. To that end, I'm curious what assumptions about the electric system, perhaps long held, no longer hold true. And I'm going to drop these questions for you guys to just sort of popcorn answer as you see fit.
We can kind of look around and figure out who's going to answer. So I'll dive into it. So from our perspective for Ameren Illinois, like we're a little bit different than ComEd. I don't know if I shared earlier, but we're obviously, we're I-80 South. So, it's 44,000 square miles. We have a system that was built 50, 60, 70, maybe even 80 years ago. And the system was designed with small generation, a lot of that was coal. Southern Illinois used to be one of a very strong coal environment, which is now retired, right? And we had a lot of these generators located throughout our service territory that were designed to move power, 15, 20 miles. Well, you fast forward to today, right, that those are no longer there. We're asking the system to do a lot more with DER and two-way flow. So from my perspective, things have really changed dramatically, over the last 10 years and probably will even more so, as we continue to go in the future.
Yeah, I agree with that. The one I was kind of looking at my notes and making sure I didn't kind of be duplicative. I was just rubbing my eyes because I'm tired because we had a storm, and this idea that, and it kind of relates to kind of the level of investment needed. Historical weather is sort of predictive of where we're going to be here going forward. I think it's become much more challenging to predict, exactly when storms are going to hit, how hard they're going to hit, and in general, I think, thinking about, weather is something a little bit more kind of within a certain bandwidth that you need to plan around. I think we're going to need to really challenge those assumptions in terms of looking at historical weather as a predictor of what we'll be facing over kind of a longer planning horizon. So from our perspective, I think that's something we're really thinking about, not just in terms of level of investment, but also how you run the business, how you think about kind of resourcing storm activity or anticipated storm activity. That's one we're dealing with. Otherwise, would kind of go back to the load growth element. That's very different in terms of what we need to assume. Two-way power flow. Absolutely agree with Brice. And then I keep thinking about this idea that load growth can move much more quickly than supply at the moment, which sort of gets, I think, to this group, which is the ability for distributed resources, including solar, to help solve that.
I'll maybe take that question from an external perspective about what I hear from customers and what, Brice mentioned too about affordability, right? That is the front page of the newspaper about 5 days a week these days. And I think from an energy perspective, there is a misperception that it's data centers driving that. And I think, first of all, affordability is regional. From Xcel Energy's perspective, given our diverse energy mix, our early investment in renewables, our rates are about 30% below the national average right now. In my opinion, we do not have an affordability issue in our states. That said, that is the general perception. And then you ask people, or they ask you at a dinner party, which is the reality of where we are right now, right? That energy is a party topic. And they're saying, why are these data centers driving up our costs? And again, I understand the difference, in the markets and the regional impacts we're seeing here. But for Xcel Energy, our data centers are doing the opposite. And in fact, they are paying their own way. They are driving down costs. And so we can get into that more later. But again, when I think about a misconception that I hear frequently, it is the data centers are driving up costs. And I think if you do it the right way, the opposite can be true. And in taking it one step further, I think they can solve our affordability problems.
Utilities have to balance a lot of competing priorities. And as we've heard, you all have different perspectives as utilities on what those priorities mean in terms of whether you manage, sort of where you sit in T&D, generation, et cetera. But a consistent theme across the country is this concept of affordability. And I'm going to use it as, I'm intentionally using the word concept because I think it means something very different depending on where you live and what the nature of your business is. How are utilities, from the perspective, the three perspectives you bring, balancing the affordability that we see in the headlines every day with reliability and the investments that are needed to prepare for the future we see coming?
Yeah, I can start. So we, there's maybe two big angles we think about how we're balancing it. One, Illinois has laid out a pretty clear framework for how to think about this, which is what we're working through here as part of our first grid plan and our subsequent grid plan. It took a couple tries on the first grid plan to get that through, but settled on a framework. One, we kind of think about things as a kind of share of wallet. So there's a framework here we have in Illinois that we follow. The expectation is affordability as measured by that benchmark is share share of wallet should be, no more than 3%. If you're not on space heat, if you are on space heat, that rises to 6%. And so when we've been filing our proposed investment plan here under the grid plans, we've been keeping an eye on that. We are at about half that level, so about 1.5% currently. So that helps make sure that we're thinking about things in a manner consistent and with the way our regulators want to think about it. Secondly, they've required a cost-benefit analysis for all the investments we propose. So there's hundreds of investments we propose as part of these multi-year plans, and we need to essentially kind of look at each single one, and anything of any material size goes through a framework that we've established that if you can quantify the benefits, lay those out. If it's regulatory required or something you have to do, we still have to look at kind of least cost approach to doing that. So that's another one that helps us make sure that we're calibrating affordability amidst other needs like reliability, et cetera. So that's on the regulatory front. And then just within the business, one thing we're doing is really making sure we can accelerate the adoption of distributed resources. When you think about one of the challenges around affordability, half the bill for us, and similar to Brice at least, given we're deregulated, is basically supply costs, which are a full pass-through for us. Just for a point of reference, back in 23, after the initial spike in gas prices from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, prices were around $30 a megawatt hour. That's your sort of energy price plus a capacity adder. It's now, this year we're on track for $70 a megawatt hour. So that is an over doubling of our supply cost, which is, about half our bill. That is truly, that pace of increase and the volatility we're seeing there is what drives some of the kind of energy, no pun intended, around kind of where utility bills are. So we are rapidly trying to, it takes, as I mentioned, a while to get centralized resources online. Illinois is working through a process to plan that out. But in the meantime, the best thing we can do, it doesn't take a long time to get solar on your roof. It doesn't take a long time to even get solar out in kind of a more like a community solar application. So accelerating that along with storage is one thing. And then lastly, customer assistance always been an important part. We connected customers to over 100 million of customers of assistance last year. Have a low income discount program as well. Just launched a 2.5 million small business initiative. So all of those things have to kind of come together in our perspective.
How refreshing to hear a utility executive tell you that you're doing your job well and we need to do more of it. Brice?
I know my audience.
Yeah, I'll say ditto to a lot of what Andy said. The fortunate thing or unfortunate when you're under the same regulatory framework, a lot of the things are true for us. Maybe I'll think about it a little bit differently from this perspective. While affordability is always top of mind, right? So running our business in a way that we as a company are looking for efficiencies, right? How do we keep the O&M line low? How do we embrace new technology, AI where applicable, right? To run our day-to-day operations and really try and start there with keeping our cost as low as possible, because as Andy mentioned, 50% of the bill is essentially out of our control. And I will tell you, the grid plan and all these proceedings that are taking place, it's challenging, right? Because we're all here, we all like to talk about the DER and bringing more DER, but we can't lose sight of what the true, one of our true needs is, and that's to provide reliable power. We've seen these storms. What does that take? It takes a lot of investment from the utilities. The weather patterns are getting more extreme. I was at the summer preparedness at the ICC the other day, and I stole this information from another person. So, so if it's incorrect, you can blame them. But essentially, this year, I think, as of we sat here today, we've had 140 tornadoes, roughly, in the state of Illinois. We always used to think about the West, or at least I did as a kid, that the Oklahoma, that area was more of the tornado alley. I think as of May or April, they had like 50 tornadoes, and we've got another round of weather coming. So I say all that because I think, as we continue to move down this path of DER integration and a clean energy transition, we have to ensure that customers have reliable energy, provided at their homes and businesses. And without making those right investments to ensure, these new technologies, composite poles, things like that, the storm hardening backbone of the system, we can get kind of out of balance a little bit with what we're trying to do.
And Bria, you all control the full stack. How does it look any different for you in Xcel?
No, I think what these guys said really resonates with me, and what I would say too. I mean, certainly when I think about balancing priorities between reliability, affordability, and sustainability, certainly those three are increasingly in tension. And so we must maintain all of them, certainly. And I think, again, I mentioned that Xcel Energy's prices are about 30% below the national average. We also have a reliability rate of 99.98% and have reduced carbon emissions by almost 60% across all 8 states, and even more than that in the Midwest. We're at about 80%. So I do think, we are making incredible progress, but also that potentially we've already done the easy work, and from here it's just more and more complex, right? So I think about the overused phrase that we're thinking about, an all of the above approach, right? We've got our centralized generation, certainly, though we are moving away from coal. We've retired a couple of our coal units already with a goal to get all of them off by 2030. We are adding some new gas, right, to meet that flexibility need when the renewables aren't there. It obviously has a lower carbon emission profile than coal, but has, not as clean as probably we would like. And then I think about DERs and the opportunity there. Xcel's got one of the largest solar programs, community solar gardens programs in the United States. We also are thinking about new partnerships and new programs. And with that, we've got this Capacity Connect program that we are rolling out right now, which is really a distributed energy a storage program, whereby we are looking for community partners to site storage at, and then we would own it, but store it at their sites, and then we would aggregate it in time of peak grid needs. What that has done is not only allowed us to continue that all of the above approach and really look in the nooks and crannies of the grid, right? We're looking for optimal locations to site this so that we have minimal distribution upgrades needed, hopefully, where we're actually able to site these. But it's also bringing new partnerships. So one of our first customers is a church, a Baptist church in a environmental justice zone. And so it's really, it's serving underserved communities and partnering with them. It is allowing us to better utilize our grid, and it's meeting the reliability and deliverability issues that we are struggling with right now. And so I think the question about balancing these, certainly, again, all increasingly in tension, but it's just requiring us that we get more creative. You're cutting your O&M, you're looking, for the most critical capital needs, but also looking for new partners and ways to generally move faster while we keep the lights on.
You mentioned earlier, Bria, the misconceptions about what's driving electricity costs, and I'm curious from you all's perspective, what factors are often overlooked in this discussion around what it actually costs to deliver affordable electricity to homeowners and businesses?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I had mentioned, I was thinking the same thing, this, misconception on kind of whether large load is sort of good, bad, like, there's sort of a knee-jerk reaction. But if, it's certainly challenging us to think differently. I think that's been a lot of the theme of this topic. Unfortunately, creating rates to recover costs is not super straightforward, and there's a big timing element to it as well. And one of what we're seeing is essentially, the ability and time to get this load online is different than sort of, when does it actually hit full load? So there are ramp ups to any of these projects. So you're usually making your upfront investment early on to ultimately serve the final expected load. And so some of that cost may start to hit rates kind of right away before you fully spread it over the load. Is one thing, and then obviously the supply side, essentially all that load largely absorbed the excess capacity in the PJM market, and so until the supply side has a chance to respond, which I think that has not moved as quickly as people would like, which is why you're seeing some initiatives at PJM to drive more kind of accountability and response there. You won't necessarily see the ultimate result, and these are 40-year lived assets, so. The verdict will take some, we won't know until 40 years, sort of, you won't have the full benefit of seeing it. And so we're reacting to kind of the near-term constraints of that timing disconnect I mentioned. So that's one thing. I was going to point out. The other one, Bria mentioned like large load tariffs. I think a lot of utilities are looking at creative ways to protect customers. One of the things we did that I think is worth pointing out is what we call a transmission security agreement, which is essentially we're requiring these large load customers to essentially commit to a 10-year revenue recovery for their investments. People will talk about, well, they should pay for the cost they cause. We've got well-established frameworks where we've actually done studies. If you just make them pay the cost they directly charge, you are not nearly going to recover, almost in every case, you're not going to recover nearly as much as you will under the existing sort of network charge rate that we have in place. And so we require them to commit to 10 years worth of that recovery, which more than offsets, the amount of investment we're typically directly making and protects customers to the extent it doesn't play out. So that's the way we're thinking about kind of protecting against these large loads.
Sure. Maybe I'll just talk a little bit about the Google deal that I mentioned earlier, because I think it's a good example of how you can protect existing customers and actually bring benefit. So this Google deal that we've got, which is located just south of the metro in Minneapolis, is I think former Secretary Granholm has multiple times called this, the template to follow for the nation. And so really proud to talk about it. And the way that we've approached it is that I think to Andy's point, Google is paying their own way, not only for all the resources they're driving, but they're also paying for their fair share of fixed costs. And so toward that, they are going to bring $1 billion of customer benefits to our existing customers. That is about $75 million on an annual basis, and all else being equal, puts downward pressure on rates to the tune of about 2%. They are driving 1,900 megawatts of new, clean, renewable energy. So that's wind, that's solar, and that is a 300 megawatt, 100-hour, long-duration storage that is going to be, by terms of capacity, the largest battery in the United States. And that's new tech, right? That's something that legitimately could displace some of the other current clean dispatchable, or some of the other firm dispatchable resources. So that's what Google is bringing to the system. They are helping decarbonize, they're bringing significant benefits, and we've done all the modeling, right? We've looked at all 8,760 hours of every year of their contract to make sure that we can serve this load and we can do it reliably without impacting our other customers negatively, and to the contrary, quite positively. We also have significant, contract terms in place that if they leave early, they'll pay. If they don't ramp when they said they would, then they'll have to pay their minimum demand, et cetera. So I feel like we've, to Andy's point, this is what we're all thinking about: is how do you do this the right way so that we can serve the demand that Google needs, but also benefit our existing customers. And so I think the narrative around data centers is dated. The fact that they're going to use all this water, that they're not environmentally friendly, that they are not a good neighbor, it's just not true. They are moving to new technology. I know our Google data center is going to be air cooled, and so if you would have replaced the land that they're using for the data center with homes, they would use more water in those homes than they will in the Google data center, which again is air cooled. They're also bringing $25 million to the local schools. I mean, they're going to bring good jobs. They're bringing taxes. I think it is a win-win for the state, the community, and our customers. And so I think it's nice to have some facts to the conversation, because frankly, the other side is not dealing in current facts, not 2026. So I think we have a real opportunity as an industry to get out in front and talk about what a good data center deal looks like and how it can be done.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just add on to some of Andy's comments. A lot of overlap there. We also are in the process of a little bit further behind than ComEd of a large load tariff of getting that. So we don't currently have any data centers located in our service territory, but the main driver of what we've seen over the last 2-3 years are these capacity charges, right? We saw a huge spike in the MISO capacity auction last year, to around $600 a megawatt day in the summer. Keep in mind, MISO is structured a little bit different. We have 4 seasons: summer, fall, winter, spring. And this year we saw it come in around $400 a megawatt day. I mean, those are huge impacts to customers. And the way it's structured is, right, we go to that rate in June 1st, and you've got a much usually cooler May time, right? ACs aren't running as much, and then all of a sudden you get the rate increase on top of higher usage in that June month, and it's frustrating to customers, and it's a little frustrating to me. I'll just be direct in the fact that we as Ameren don't control that, right? It's done through the structures of the regulatory framework that we're in, and we have to put those charges on the bill and collect it dollar for dollar with no markup, and provide it to where it needs to go. So I think we've really got to think about how we balance all this. How do we help our customers and really try and get control of these capacity prices to ensure we can make the investments and keep things affordable for customers kind of as we move into the future.
As we get closer to the end of our time here, one of the things I want to make sure we do cover is most of the folks in the audience are in some way deploying these distributed energy resources, and it bears the question, where are we seeing choke points to deploying DERs at scale that we actually have some flexibility to remove, and how are you seeing the planning around that evolve? I wanted to add a question that came in from a friend who is a commissioner in Colorado, and I thought it bears sort of. I'm going to read it exactly as he positioned it to me, because I asked him, "What would you ask?" And he says, "As customers become increasingly active participants in the system, how do we appropriately recognize and value flexibility as a grid service?" So maybe that says it a little better than how I said it.
Well, I'm happy to start. I could probably talk a long time on this. So yeah, we talked about our service territory earlier, right? The size of a 44,000 square miles. Now we have currently 1.5 gigawatts of DER that's integrated, running on the system. Now keep in mind, this is a system that's about a 7 to 8 gigawatt peaking system. What we have found is we are discovering power quality issues, and the engineering acronym for it is a WSCR, weighted short circuit ratio. And what it is, it's variations in the power flow that's showing up at residential and customers' homes, right? This was something that came about. I mean, I'm not an engineer, so but it is an engineering possibility. But we really saw it firsthand start to show its head in our service territory, and the reason we saw it is because we had complaints. We had customers that had flickering lights flickering because of the power. It wasn't even registering outage. It was just more of a variation in the frequency of the energy. So it's an issue, right? We recognize it, especially with you in the audience. This is having a significant impact on a lot of the solar community and getting through the queue. We've got queues that have hundreds of DER applications that are pending there, and then we're bumping up against this weighted short circuit ratio, which we've just started doing the testing. I mentioned we have 1.5 that's energized, that's out on the system. We have another 3.4 gigawatts that are through the queue, that are waiting to be interconnected, but they're going to be susceptible to this testing. We understand it's an issue from Ameren's perspective, right? And we are rolling our sleeves up. We're making modifications in the grid plan that's currently being discussed at the Illinois Commerce Commission. We're trying to work with developers to find solutions to this, whether that be technology based, maybe it's moving the system a little bit from one area to the other. But it's essentially, we have these long circuits where the power flow was only needed for a couple farmhouses, and then you put a lot of DER in there, and it comes in as a grid flow, inverter, and the power quality just isn't there. And it's not a good look for anyone, right? It's not a good look for Ameren. We can't have customers with power quality issues, and it certainly isn't. We don't want it to have a negative impact on, the clean energy transition and what's causing these. So, we look forward to continue to work with folks and trying to, resolve these issues kind of as we move forward.
Yeah, I echo a lot of that. We're seeing the same thing in Xcel, and I would just say, yeah, we need to better integrate DER into our planning so that we can utilize the grid, put the DER where it's needed, because to Brice's point, that we've got, our system is kind of at the max, and so certainly we can upgrade, we can do that, but there also are opportunities on the existing grid that we can better utilize, and so I think it's planning and partnerships is what we really need to take it to the next level.
Yeah, and then very low on time here. The only other one I was thinking about is, we've had time variant rates, real time pricing in particular, for a long time. I was shocked how long we've had it. We still only have, out of our residential customers, 1.6% of them are on hourly pricing, which I was shocked by. And the average savings people get is something like 16% from being on the hourly rate versus the default blended rate. I think when people start to engage, it's more of an engagement question. I still think you have a lot of people that are passive users of the grid. Understandably, they see it as sort of a utility service and whatever. But I think, as someone in the industry, I expect, of course, I'm going to be a little bit more engaged. But I think there's a real opportunity for customers to save money, and I think part of it is just getting the mind share to recognize, there's it's going to require a little more engagement, but they have a real opportunity to actually take affordability into their own hands and find a way to engage in the grid that's more valuable and kind of economic for them. So I would just add in that element as well.
So we've got about maybe 4 or 5 more minutes before we have to wrap. As you look out maybe 3 to 5 years, 2030 timeframe, what do you hope the Midwest grid looks like? And we'll start back here, Andy, with you. Take a little more time on valuing flexibility if you need. But what do you hope the grid looks like in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, Brice and I were talking about that, and it's the final year of our grid plan is actually 2031. So I guess I should just read chapter 2030 in that one. I'd love to see more progress in interconnection. I was thinking about this. We've got there's the RTO interconnection process is, especially in PJM, has gotten a lot of attention, and they've been working through a transition. They just reopened it, and they got something like over 800 applications for over 200 gigawatts. A lot, across sort of a variety of technologies. I'll be really interested to see where we are on that front by 2030. I'd also, we've got PJM has other initiatives underway, a reliability backstop procurement mechanism where they're looking into bilaterals, and then sort of another backstop. They're also working on a connect and manage framework. We haven't talked a lot about data center flexibility, but I think we're the new terms and conditions of connecting are going to require the willingness and ability to ramp until we have sort of the infrastructure in place to serve them. And so, we'll be, several years into that journey, and that'll be interesting to watch. And then, I think we've talked about a lot of the other themes, a lot more distributed resources. We're seeing similar growth as Brice. I hadn't realized what penetration level they have, but we're certainly seeing a lot of growth in distributed resources, not quite the same percent. And so I think that'll be an area to watch on our front as well.
Thanks, Andy.
Sure. I think very basic. I'm looking for it to be reliable, more flexible, cleaner, and certainly affordable. And I think at the end of the day, when these things feel really hard and really challenging, we've got a bunch of things to solve at once. I am reminded that we have done very complex transitions before. And in fact, we are doing it, right? I know for Xcel, we have retired several of our coal plants already. We have replaced them with renewable resources, and we are keeping the lights on. We are doing it, and we're doing it well. And, compared to what we have done over the past several years, we've got even more improved technology. We've got better partnerships. We've got a lot of things that we can leverage that we didn't have before as we've done complex transitions. So I think we're in the middle of figuring it out, but I'm optimistic that we will be able to do just that.
Yeah, and agree with everything that's said. I guess I think about it from an all of the above approach, right? It's VPP, it's flexible interconnections, it's all these things, right? I think it's critical for us as utilities and utility executives to, especially here in the state of Illinois under the CEJA and the structure of the law, that we continue to work together and form partnerships and collaborate through these issues. It's going to take a lot of planning, a lot, and I think we're heading down the right path in Illinois related to CEJA and the multi-year grid plan, but also that IRP, right? How do we continue to ensure we're looking at data-driven scenarios of how we continue to progress into the future?
Would that we had another half hour to really dig in to all of our prepared notes and the questions that we had to skip. We've covered a lot of ground. I know that all three of you, I think, are going to be able to stick around for a little while. Don't have to rush away. So we'll be sort of towards the back here. Please join me in thanking Andy Plenge, Bria Shea, and Brice Sheriff for sharing their perspectives. And thank you all the early birds for getting here on time. I'm Nico Johnson, your host. Welcome once again to Solar Energy Storage North America Midwest.